The Witcher, Hexer, Chapter 8 Master Druid Scchiyaptukuputa and the War between Monsters and Men. Once Maiden Haunch was overtaken by the strange stone-like parasitic creatures, there was a new level of black magic achieved that had never before happened anywhere on Earth. Trilzum's otherworldly powers combined with Scchiyaptukuputa's spell power was incredibly powerful once mingled inside a host. They realized this once she began levitating in her sleep with a bioluminescence radiating from her skin. After the maiden had the desired child princess in their possession, they bled the maiden to test her blood. It proved to be the most potent blood magic they had ever experimented with. This would be the new key to creating an army to fight against the Royal Guard. In those days, the Royal Guard of the Forest Kingdom had been built up to the strongest it had ever been before the war broke out between monsters and men. Many men and monsters died because of the Chaos War started by the powerful magic spells of Master Druid Scchiyaptukuputa, the creature from the underworld. S poured the blood gathered from the host maiden into the water supply of the forest castle, contaminating with blackest of hexation, the likes the earth had never seen. This called the Witcher to battle amongst both monsters and men, who had become overtaken by the powerful spells of S, the Master Druid Hexer. S was the master of sorcery, who could do as she wilt effortlessly. With the black scepter in hand, the powers intensified from the blackness of the underworld, making the spell's unseen penetration into the mind of victims impossible to defend against. The reason why Geralt of Rivia wasn't able to prevent the taking of Sorella was because of the powerful magic the Master Druid had wielded and performed to the most masterful degree upon the land. People were being controlled by the powers of darkness, both beyond the stars and beneath the earth, where the riches of the underworld and its true essence lie. Unless one was a witcher or sorceress, the likes of Yennefer, there was little hope for combat concerning this unseen force that was domineering the forest lands and its kingdom. Blood was shed to a degree of sickening reprieve. Geralt cut through many people he otherwise never would have, due to the black magic of the real underworld that had been kept silent and trapped to brood. Encounters were brief when Geralt and his band of misfits would come across the ones under the control of S and Trilzum. Geralt the Witcher didn't realize at the time what exactly was going on, because he knew not of the existence of Trilzum, nor the deeply hidden Master Druid known as S. When he first heard the rumors of S, he was on the road with his band of misfits, being strengthened and encouraged in battle against some monsters running amok in a remote village with the vastness of the deep forest wilderness outside the kingdom. Geralt had known something was wrong prior to overhearing the rumors of the elusive druidic creature, thought to be merely man. Scchiyaptukuputa was no man nor woman, for this creature was self-sufficient in breeding. Once it could be relieved of the centuries of stress the dark creature had been subjected to by the old curse, which was bound to its very being through creation. Created in darkness of the blackest of black magic, the Master Druid was formed to be the creature of chaos, with the sole purpose to destroy mankind, the curse of curses. This was S's destiny, but fate would only grant this discord for only a time. The reign of Scchiyaptukuputa would seem like it would never come to an end until it was over. Geralt had seen many rulers come and go, and in their times these tyrants would seem to be unstoppable. genocidal elf destroyers, slave drivers, taskmasters of the dwarves, and persecutors of mankind through the harshest of conditions, had come and gone in the many lifetimes of Witcher Geralt. Witcher Geralt was tired of seeing such endless cycles and patterns of the same corrupt tyranny. As soon as he heard of the elusive Master Druid S, he went from the path and drew back to where he came from, knowing this corruption was at the castle, and spreading behind, as if following him and his band of misfits who were loyally following. Geralt of Rivia knew that he could not continue in his pursuit of Duny and Princess Pavetta, because the battle was coming to him. Instead of continuing the way he knew was leading directly into their trap and their envisioned plan for his demise, Geralt went head to head with this hunt. All he heard was that people were turning on each other within the ranks of the Forest Kingdom's royal guard, and that knights who were as brothers were slain by each other's hand, which was not making any sense to anyone. Once Geralt had turned back, fear secretly crept in his thoughts, never for himself, but of the people. Hearing about this betrayal between loved ones was disheartening, even to the hardened of heart. Geralt was worried for Duny and Pavetta, whom he had grown to be rather fond of, having a secret soft spot in his blackened heart reserved for them and their shared suffering, as children of surprise spawning another child of surprise. What a wicked world, he always thought to himself, yet keeping these sentiments to himself, because this lamentation was not part of his ways outwardly, being the Witcher he truly was. This was only one of many traits Geralt didn't even recognize himself having, since he cared not for recognition from any man. He walked in his integrity as the lone white wolf naturally, and Yennefer knew this of him, whilst christening him with the medallion. When Geralt arrived back to the edges of the Forest Castle territory, he saw many already dead, displayed bodies of the fallen in gruesome fashion about the yard. He had just missed the breakout of battle, and also just left before having the chance to run into Trilzum, Scchiyaptukuputa, Maiden Haunch, and the taken infant Sorella. The maiden was used as a sick tool to counter the prevention of the abduction. Duny and Princess Pavetta failed to prevent the kidnapping because of the thick webs of trickery spells. The deception magic was far too dense to be seen straight through, even by the most powerful Pavetta in all her power. The next morning, after being trusted that night with the baby Princess Sorella, Maiden Haunch was guided by the concentrated powers of Trilzum and Scchiyaptukuputa in what to do to pull off the impossible. The possessed maiden was led to Duny in the early morning, where she was in a great panic, explaining that wizards of the ancient Druidic order had come and taken their daughter from him and Princess Pavetta. When Pavetta heard the panic, she ran out the door of their room to Duny and fell at his feet in hysterics. Their baby Ciri was just outside of their sight, being held by Trilzum, while hovering just out of sight above the treetops. S was waiting in the forest alone to speak with Princess Pavetta and Duny. Duny came charging into the forest. Soon as the maiden pointed in the direction the supposed baby thieves went with his child. Standing there waiting was the cloaked Dark One, Master Druid Scchiyaptukuputa. I am S. Your child was not taken by druids. This sorceress has tricked you into thinking this vile thing. She lies for your mother, who has planned to take your child for herself indefinitely. Scchiyaptukuputa spoke under the black veil, which only its monstrous living eyes could see through. You lie! You lie! Pavetta came running into the back of her husband. You lie, Druid! This woman is still with us, Dooney proclaimed. You think she is with you? How sad. This is unfortunate for you. I come to give good counsel before your child is taken too far, and may never return into your good company as the rightful parents. S began weaving the spells intricately into existence with careful words of deception. How can we believe such nonsense when she just came to us telling of you, yourself, being the one who has taken our daughter? Princess Pavetta began doubting her own words as her husband Dooney was puzzled as to why the maiden haunch was not there behind them. Looks like you've been tricked by this woman. She must have fooled you into believing it was I, who has come to warn you of her treachery, has done the thing she set out to do. She cannot be too far. We must go now to stop her before she meets with the Queen's guards, who wait to take her and your baby back to the castle. These guards wish to end your lives along the way. Scchiyaptukuputa was convincing. Meanwhile, Geralt was examining bodies that lay in the forest castle yard. He noticed the common pattern in their deaths. These men were all stabbed deep in their skulls by entrance of their ear canals. Some men fell next to each other while being killed in the process. The first two royal guards that Geralt looked over on the ground were laying peculiarly. Geralt couldn't figure it out, or make any sense of any of this. One man lay dead with a sword through his chest. That man who had been stopped by the sword still clung to the dagger in his hand tightly, as it was embedded deep into the other man's ear. After noticing this first series of murders, he moved on closer to the castle, and saw a man speared to the ground, spade through the ear. The man laying next to this body was decapitated, and the head was cleanly cut off, signifying a swift blow of the axe that had come down a second time to cut the severed head in half, neatly down the middle, severing both ears, face intact. Once Geralt got closer to the forest castle, he heard the noise of battle. Trilzum was hovering above the trees next to Scchiyaptukuputa. S successfully tempted Dooney and Princess Pavetta to attack him, and this gave the Master Druid the upper hand, as he had used a spell to feed off of their emotions. This was intoxicating to the newly married couple, and they became drunk with rage, fear, worry, angst, and frustration that ate at their guts. This made them extremely tired, and soon as they saw what was happening with their child, they passed out, sleeping in the forest for 3 solid hours. Dooney lunged forward to unmask S with the help of Pavetta, who started to yell in subsonic vibrations that propelled her husband in a whirlwind, making the swing of his short broadsword intensely intimidating. Scchiyaptukuputa put forward his scepter and touched Dooney's wildly rotating blade. The sword broke into pieces like a shattered glass. As Princess Pavetta and Dooney could no longer fight the sleepiness that was heavy upon them, their eyes fought to stay open, while S pointed upward with his black scepter. Scchiyaptukuputa did not point upwards at Trilzum, because he was no longer there. This is because S had been the decoy man distraction Trilzum needed to bring the maiden haunch up in his place, along with the precious infant princess. Little Ciri was suspended in the air, being held up by the maiden. She hovered on top of her fingertips while the powers of the Hex worked their magic. Blackest of blood spell power brought this heinously devised plan to fruition. The blessings of the Count subsided as this granted the demise of their time to be less horrific, which the malevolent three always knew their days would end in due time. This time, though, was their time. Pavetta looked up at her newborn daughter as she fought to keep her eyes open. The heaviness was unbearable, and sleep overcame them, while she saw her husband weeping in his dreams. Dooney fell unconscious a couple seconds sooner, since he was using more of his energy, thus using more feeling and emotion to fuel Scchiyaptukuputa's wicked spell-weaving. Princess Pavetta, however, was using less of her energy through her natural power, as a sorceress of sorts. Princess Pavetta's mind was her own source of magical powers. The princess lay her head down in the dirt with sorrow heavily weighted down on her conscience. Little Ciri was floating above the fingertips of this maiden haunch who floated togetherly beneath. In this moment, Pavetta knew that it was her mother who crafted this elaborate deception to take her daughter away. As Pavetta slept, she fought against the amnesia spell and did not win nor lose. She subsequently lost because of the loss of time with her daughter and the temporary loss of memory as to exactly what happened. Pavetta forced her mind to hold on to what she had seen. Dooney was spared the truth only to learn much later what happened from his wife. Anytime Princess Pavetta thought about what had happened, she was confused, wondering if she had dreamed what she had actually seen. Things became blurry as the spell from Scchiyaptukuputa took over. Her memory clinged on to the truth of what had happened, and the princess trusted this. She knew she remembered these things for a reason. Maiden Haunch was floating above S while standing over Pavetta and Dooney. Pavetta saw the maiden bring little Ciri into her arms, after suspending her in the air while floating on her fingertips. Maiden Haunch cradled her tight into her bosom and rotated in spiral motion, feet first, after looking down at Pavetta. The maiden winked her eye, waved her hand 2 times down at Pavetta, then drew her hand back to Sorella as they went off in the direction of the castle, feet first in spiraling flight. As she fell asleep, Princess Pavetta struggled within her mind between the 2 thoughts of possibilities. Either this druid who called itself S was telling the truth, or only partly the truth. The princess could not understand why this druid would be making such a lie about the maiden, if indeed was helping the queen obtain her daughter Sorella. This made no sense in her spellbound mind. Pavetta simply could not understand such evil motives. Geralt of Rivia would not see this maiden arrive at the forest castle as she flew overhead with the infant Ciri cradled tightly in her arms, silently spinning. The battle between guards was breaking out thoroughly throughout all the ranks, and Witcher Geralt was caught in the middle of it all. Tia, Vea, Borch, and the bard were with him up until he was near the forest castle. They were stopped by Trilzum, as Geralt rode on ahead of them all too fast in his urgency. So, as the battle broke out, Geralt found himself alone. The lone white wolf did what he does best. Geralt was good with numbers. The more the merrier he would be. He could calculate blows between adversaries like the master swordsman he was. He spun off his horse once, hopping back on the saddle to ride only a few gallops closer before realizing what he had ridden into. With his elbow, Geralt hit the side of a guard's helmet, bringing the raging man to the ground. Geralt timed this perfectly for his steed to bring the hooves down, smashing the brains out of the guard's head. The crushed helmet had been converted into a brain bowl of gray mush, similar to forest mushroom soup, splattered outside the bowl, which was the unrecognizable iron helmet. Geralt did not understand why these men were fighting amongst themselves. About a third of these men were raging violently, as if they had been provoked by some outrageous act of offense. Their fighting was unnatural, and Geralt recognized this change of technique. Geralt saw men flying to the ground and immediately flying back up as if being lifted by every fiber of their muscles. The exuberance was outlandish of these fights, which broke out all across the Forest Castle yard. One after the other became unruly and bestial in nature. Geralt drank his potion which Yennefer had given him, and he too became morbidly bestial. His eyes turned pitch black, and his veins shone black, bursting all over his body just under the skin. His skin heaved, while his pulse was visible in his head. Geralt, the White Wolf, was baring his teeth like a wild animal provoked. The Witcher gave long strides with his strong legs, and sideswiped the blade of his longsword through 3 men who charged at him on either side, as well as straight ahead, head to head. Geralt then stabbed his blade into the center guard's mouth, throwing him aside into some battling guards. This made the 2 he interfered with angry with him, and charged at Geralt with ferocity of possessed monsters. Geralt threw the man by the mouth with his sword, and he flew like a fucking ragdoll. The 2 battling men were pummeled by the fresh carcass as they were knocked down to the ground like children's games. Geralt of Rivia then witnessed the one stab the other into the ear with his spear by taking the man's head into his hands and forcing the head down onto the tip of the spear as the other spiked end was stuck into the ground. The man screamed an ungodly howl and then screeched out until it died out with his last breath. What kind of barbarity is this? Madness! This is madness! Geralt cried out to the hundreds of men who fought amongst themselves. A young noble guard came to Geralt, who was near him, crying nearly at the top of his lungs, but his voice was exhausted and cracking. "The men have become possessed! This is a hex! These men are not possessed!" Geralt threw his hatchet at a deranged knight's face, and it split open between the nose and eye. This blow killed the man, most certainly, but he began flailing like a monster. His hands ripped at his own chest, then up his neck, and the fingers made their way into the hatchet wound in his face. The struck guard was trying to close his face up. The attempt clearly wasn't working, and massive amounts of blood came pouring out onto the ground, along with pieces of flesh. When the struck man realized the insane attempt to repair his own split-open face proved to be ineffective, the strange frustration came in the form of a fit, like a child with bad behavior. This guard, who was clearly out of his mind, began tearing out pieces of his own flesh from inside the wound of his face, then stopped after yanking at his eye. This made him scream like a dying, hunted elk. The scene was unlike anything Geralt had even heard of. The Witcher was beginning to believe now what the young man had rushed to tell him. Absurdity! Who is responsible for this? Don't tell me it's this fucking druid who calls himself S. Geralt addressed this young knight as he fought off another, who would not back off with repeated charges, even after having his right arm cut off. "Yes, you've guessed right. The rumor is true. This black-veiled druid is a traitor," the young unnamed knight cried out in earnest reply. "This druid has done something to these men. This must be an old spell, or some powers we do not yet understand from the monsters." Geralt gave his best guess, which was close to the truth of the situation at hand. Geralt would find the culprit coming out from the wound of the man hit with his hatchet that was thrown into his face. The culprit, or culprits rather, came pouring out of the guard's facial abscess that he was tearing at with his own hands. Now Geralt understood why this guard did what he did. He was releasing something that was in his head. The nasal cavity was connected to the ear, and so Geralt saw firsthand why the men were stabbing each other in the ear. These small stone-like spikes began wiggling their way out of the guard's gaping facial wound. An elder guard ran towards Geralt, which made the Witcher think he was trying to attack him at first. "These men are drinking the water from the castle ducts. It's been contaminated by these strange worms." Geralt picked one up, picked straight out of the face of the man he hit with his hatchet, and squeezed this writhing worm with his thumb and index finger. "Their skin is not soft like that of any worm I've ever encountered. They're made of stone." "That is correct, my lord. You have observed rightly. My God, you are as strong as they say." The young knight looked both impressed and shocked at the same time, while Geralt of Rivia crushed this worm that none of the men could squish, as the damned thing tried to bite and burrow itself into Geralt's glove. The rabid man with the hatchet wound in his face jumped up at Geralt in some outrageous attempt to strangle him, and the young knight threw Geralt's hatchet into the ear that had not been severed from the inside of this guard's skull within his nasal passage. "Good throw, kid. You'll make a good knight yet." Geralt was excitedly impressed and swung his sword into the chest of the falling corpse so the body wouldn't fall towards him. "I have a strange feeling like this has happened before." The young knight rubbed his head. "The dead all seem to run together in this marathon as we slay," Geralt professed. "You must have killed many a people in the same ways," the young knight remarked. "Similarly, yes, but I've never seen pointed stone skin worms come out of a man's hatchet wound from his face." Geralt reflected. "Good point," the unnamed young knight said straight-faced, as he anticipated the next oncoming attackers. A moving crowd of royal guards stampeded on their heels, fighting back against each other, with a sense of urgency showing on the expression of each and every face as they snarled. Geralt exterminated all the remaining men who did not move aside when he gave his warning of his oncoming warpath charge. "Stand aside, or be cut down!" Geralt heaved in his chest, large breaths, summoning his strength. Geralt the Witcher only waited for about 3 seconds before he charged. He knew that the good men who respected him and trusted him would be those who would move out of his way. Most men stood aside soon as they could. There were a few who could not stop or didn't want to stop the fights they were involved with. Be it grudge, be it pride, they all would die as they chose their fate, standing in the warpath of the Witcher. His sword ran them through 2 by 2 as he skewered the fools overtaken by those things that bring the fall of man. Instead of pulling the blade out of their bodies, Geralt jerked his sword to the side ripping through half of each abdomen or chest he impaled through their torsos. Whether they wore armor or not, Geralt of Rivia had driven the blade of his sword through with brute force, executing with precision that of the most excellency and efficiency. He painted the forest castle yard red with blood of the overtaken royal guards. The queen would be furious when she had learned what Scchiyaptukuputa had done. With what the druidic creature of the underworld had started, this was only the beginning. Geralt felt no remorse for those guards. He knew that for the most of them he was merely carrying out their wishes, to spare them a prolonged death, which was a living death of excruciating metastasizing of each devoured living cell. No one in their right mind would wish to die this way, being eaten from a subtle infection that would start in the sinuses, making its way to the brain by spreading through the connected ear canals, where the little rock-like creatures would make their home within the wax until it would be depleted and gone. Once a victim would be used up and dry, with no more mucus or wax, then the tiny worms would make their way out of the body, or head rather, to make their way to the next potential host. After Geralt had slaughtered the prideful along with the overtaken royal guards, the lone white wolf realized what he needed to do. The legend Geralt of Rivia proved he thought well on his toes. Geralt knew as soon as he recognized these rare creatures for what they were, that he needed to exterminate them in the most effective way he knew how. If the water was contaminated, then he would burn it to a boil, and also the bodies he had just slain that had been hosts to these disgusting parasites. The slain parasitic worms inadvertently asked to be burned for what they had done to the noblemen of the Forest Castle's royal guard. They screamed as the lantern and lamp oil mixed into the water, mingling with the toxic blood poison mixture that gave rise to their spreading through the hexation and power between Trilzom and Scchiyaptukuputa's works. Geralt had to throw the 100+ bodies into the burning, boiling, bloody water. He then took the used wine barrels reserved to be refilled for the queen's daily desire, not for her people so much as her atrocious habit, and disregarded them without care. Geralt cut off the tops, opening the wine barrels, then filled them with the burning, boiling water. He dumped the concoction methodically in and around the bloodied lawn. As to be expected, the unexpected happened, as it always came, paradoxically. The act unknowingly summoned the spirit of the extinct creatures. Geralt of Rivia was responsible for making these old rare creatures of the underworld wiped out, off the face of the earth. In his mind, it was good riddance, and there was no doubt. He knew even in his blackened heart as a Hexer that what he did was right, since these things were from a place that had never been intended to be shared with any human, or seen by any creature's eyes. Trilzom's powers he channeled from the essence of the stars sparked the invoked reverse prayer of reincarnated birth. By way of the last boiling bits that remained of Scchiyaptukuputa's magic as it burned out, the final hexation was completed. A giant godlike monstrosity was rising from the flames that came out of the boiling mess in the ground that once was the beautiful, peaceful forest castle yard. This beast was the first of the stone worms, whose name was lost to the passing of ages throughout time. Geralt would be tested like never before, having to find a way to defeat this seemingly impenetrable monstrous beast. The ground became like heat waves from the hot summer sun, only it was night. These waves from the steam became like nausea in the desert land and dizzied Geralt once he began to breathe in the toxic fumes. Things like this never bothered a Witcher, so Geralt knew that this was not some ordinary heat reaction from the boiling contaminated water. He quickly realized that the sensations he was experiencing was from the powers of black magic stronger than he expected through that blood spell. Geralt of Rivia did not yet understand that there was also another cosmic evil power that was in play as well, strengthening the powers of the underworld. The affected ground no longer looked natural. Things became lit by the colors of the oil fire and were shown in a different unnatural light, which gave an unsettling vibe that disturbed the remaining men who did not drink from the water those days, thankfully, since these knights and guards had gathered water for their households the day before Scchiyaptukuputa had contaminated the supply within the forest castle. Trees and bushes were not brown and green, but looked like dark rainbows from the oil, mostly blues, purples, and dark reds with hints of green, with splotches of orange, red, and specks of golden yellows. There was a green tint over everything that was like the demon spell that comes out of the selfish lust spell of virginal youth. The dogs of the royal guard didn't want anything of this strangeness, as they howled and barked until they were allowed out of their designated area gates to run out into the forest outside of the castle yard. The white wolves of the forest howled like crazy at their noise, along with the running dogs' ruckus bounced around in the forest valley off the surrounding mountains. Even the squirrels were shaken up in the trees by this echoing panic from the dogs and the wolves, making many the squirrels chatter like chuckling laughter. Only their noise also was out of distress. The birds all had flown away. Not one bird had a lack of sense to stick around. After the owls had taken off, then the rest of the birds of the forest knew it was time to go. Out of the developing atmosphere, like the conjunction of the spheres, the dimensional change brought a vortex of cataclysmic change between worlds. This was the uprooted underworld, and one of its ancient kings, the King Worm, the Stone Worm. Geralt of Rivia watched as this thing manifested from pure essence and smoke that was coming up from the ground, rising slowly, and not behaving like the ways of smoke from fire. There was a guided path to where the smoke drifted, and there could be seen within this kind of sleuth an apparitional movement within its center, inside each strand that branched out, flowing through the misty night in the humid forest air that was rich with sustenance, feeding the life that was within this old spirit that had found its body once more through the extinct children that had been summoned and came back to the source embodied.